Just have a panel discussion, so we're not going to show a bunch of slides. Yay. And so I'd like to just have my two colleagues introduce themselves. Mike?
Yeah, sure. My name is Mike Bell. I'm Senior Vice President and General Manager for Corning. I've been with Corning for 23 years. And part of our business is wireless, of course. We're into distributed antenna systems, as well as all kinds of other optical networks.
All right, my name is Jim Parker. I'm Senior Manager with AT&T's Antenna Solutions Group. AT&T formed the Antenna Solutions Group right about 4 years ago. We focus primarily in-building wireless for large public venues. The technologies that we deploy are neutral host as small cells and Wi-Fi.
Thanks, Jim. So what we thought we would do is just a couple of things here. Number one, over the years, recent years, there's been a number of campus incidents and other things that have raised questions with regards to wireless coverage inside of dorms, classrooms, and other buildings. What we thought we would do in this session today is talk about four main subjects. One, what is the applicability of wireless technologies in different types of buildings within the campus? Second, costs and business models. Third, stakeholders and procurement requirements. And fourth, deployment considerations. And the format we're going to use today is I'm going to just throw out a couple of questions to my colleagues, and then I'll pick up a couple of questions, and we'll try to hit each one of these, and we'll leave time at the end, a good 15, 20 minutes for Q&A with the audience as well, so we can have a conversation with you. So we see this just as sort of a conversation, and we'll ask you all to join in. So with that said, I'll start, and we'll throw the first one out to Jim. And Jim, just what is a distributed antenna system, and how is it used in today's campuses? And how do small cells differ?
Well, a distributed antenna system will take an RF source, and as the name implies, using a lot of antennas and a lot of cable will distribute that signal throughout the property. How it differs from a small cell solution. A small cell solution typically uses a standalone box, which provides the RF resources. So when you kind of compare and contrast the advantages and disadvantages of a neutral host DAS system vis-a-vis of a small cell, the advantage of a neutral host DAS system is it can be neutral hosted, in that we, or the venue owner, could deploy the distributed antenna system, and then the multiple wireless operators or carriers can join that system and leverage the shared wire resources that the DAS provides. The other advantage of a distributed antenna system is it can handle a lot of capacity. So we can support multiple technologies, like GSM, UMTS, CDMA 2000, LTE, and even LTE Advanced. So we can support multiple technologies, multiple frequencies, whereas when you're looking at small cells, at this point in time, there is not a neutral host small cell. So if you wanted to have all four Tier 1 carriers have small cells support this room, we'd have to have 4 small cells in that corner, and the next room we'd have to have 4 small cells, each small cell for each wireless carrier. It's really not an optimal condition. So really, from my perspective, where we differentiate, where a neutral host DAS and a small cell fits into play, where small cells are primarily a coverage-only solution, where you just need to light up a small area. They're really not set up for the capacity, and they're also best used only in situations where we just don't need a neutral host solution. So we kind of compare and contrast.
Thanks, Jim. So, Mike, Jim talked about cellular technology in the campus. Well, Wi-Fi is very common across dorms and classrooms and other buildings. Can Wi-Fi be combined with DAS or small cells?
The answer to that, of course, is sure it can. What we think about when combining those is a medium node that can handle the capacity needed for more than one service or solution. And so typically, we could either set up the infrastructure such that it shares, multiple technologies share infrastructure. And even in that shared situation, we can have dedicated lanes, basically, or fibers or other media for those particular solutions all within the same network. Now, when I'm thinking about the requirements for that network to support multiple technologies like DAS, small cells, and Wi-Fi, I want to make sure that it, first of all, has a high capacity, because there's lots of different things that you might want to do with that, repurpose that, as it were, later as you grow and your business grows, and as your campus grows, and the needs of all your different constituents grow, because of the technology changes, as well as just the different usages that students or faculty or others that visit the campus might have for their smart devices or other things that they would use in the future. We have to think about remote powering of devices. In fact, all these antennas have to get power from somewhere, so the network has to be able to provide sufficient capacity for future needs, as well as remote powering to make sure all the devices work. And the media that are used, and we of course work for Corning, so we think fiber is optimal for this, because it has nearly unlimited bandwidth. You really want a media too that you can put in for your infrastructure needs that supports Ethernet, cellular, as well as public safety and a whole host of other applications for the future. So the answer is yes, we can create an infrastructure that supports multiple technologies, kind of leverage the IT dollars as far as they can possibly.
Super, thanks, Mike. So the next question actually comes to me, and I'll ask it of myself. So with a variety of solutions, how does an institution leverage these solutions in dorms and classrooms, and are there any restrictions associated with the solution? So, Black Box Network Services, we come at this, we're not a manufacturer, we're not a carrier, we are a systems integrator. So our role in the world is to help institutions leverage these various technologies. So we have sort of an open view of what's going on. And our perspective, having done this now for the last 15 years with institutions, we work in both the cellular world and in the Wi-Fi world. And one of the things that we look at in this environment is that you have a lot of choices. There's outdoor macro, there's outdoor DAS, there's indoor DAS, there's Wi-Fi. But one of the things that we suggest is that an institution look at it from the user population, the user base. And we think there's really three uses of wireless inside of an institution. There's consumer use, that's us walking around using it as a guest, what have you. There's the enterprise use of wireless, that's where wireless is used by the enterprise for the running of the enterprise, the campus, etc. And the third is those things that become mission and or life critical. And so maybe in your healthcare institutions, you're using wireless to actually deliver patient care, what have you. And so the choice of technology should be governed by the user or the use case for those technologies, and to pick the technologies that will work. And it's going to be a combination of Wi-Fi, wireless LAN, and cellular-based technologies. And as the suppliers, as the carriers, and the device manufacturers with new application and capabilities, you have the choice of picking the best network to serve the needs of the campus. And so we think that's the proper way to go. We don't really see restrictions in any sense, other than the fact that pick the right technology that works for the given building, given venue, and given use case on campus. So that's kind of how our perspective on that. Before moving on to the second section, any comments on this section from Jim or Mike? If not, I'll move to the next.
In terms of Jim's answer on distributed antenna systems, one other advantage I was thinking about as you were answering too, is just the direction of capacity. So you have a big base station with lots of capacity, and if the DAS is designed to be able to do this, you can actually steer that capacity to different parts of the campus, kind of follow the student during the day, or you may have a lot of capacity for certain places where a lot of people gather, and you don't need that when those places are vacant. The use of different types of DAS technologies can actually redirect that capacity to different places where people actually are when they're not in the basketball stadium. I thought that's interesting too. Small cells are kind of stuck wherever they are.
Yeah, very good point. All right, so let's move on to the costs and business models section. And Jim, I'm going to come back to you again. In higher education and DAS, certainly in stadiums and arenas, the most common funding models are carrier-led or funded and third-party led or funded models. What are some of the key considerations with respect to ownership and long-term obligations?
Well, I tell you, these DAS systems are really expensive. And you know, if they weren't expensive, we wouldn't even be having these conversations. There's several business models in use. One of course is the venue would own the infrastructure. The other model would be the carrier would own the infrastructure, and it would either be a system designed for a single carrier solution, or it would be a neutral host solution. And the other option is a third-party neutral host, where a third party would take overall responsibility for the solution. So when you're looking at a distributed antenna system, there's a couple components. One, the wireless operators have spent an inordinate amount of money giving money to our federal government to have rights to transmit in that frequency. So as such, the wireless operator will own the RF source. In this sense, we typically deploy dedicated base stations for our distributed antenna systems. So we'll own the RF source. We'll also own the backhaul, because we want to make sure that we have enough backhaul traffic to handle the load and demand of this network. So really what we're talking about that's up for discussion regarding the business models is actually the DAS infrastructure, which includes the head end, remote units, the antennas, and all the cabling associated with it. So the owner of the system would then take ownership and responsibility for the actual, CapEx, the purchase of the system. They would be responsible for coordinating with the various carriers that they would like to have installed on their network. And then, of course, they're responsible for the ongoing maintenance of that system. Unfortunately, things go out and things go bump in the middle of the night, and things need to be replaced and repaired. So those are the various models. I talked about the single carrier model versus a neutral host carrier model. In the early days, the wireless carriers tended to only deploy a single carrier solution, but with the realization of today that most users would prefer to have one set of infrastructure support all the wireless carriers, a single carrier model is not being used as much as it used to be. All the systems that our organization deploys are neutral host as a result.
Thanks, Jim. Excuse me. Thanks, Jim. All right, so the next question comes back my way. How does the enterprise business model work, and what benefit does an institution receive when deploying a neutral host solution with or without Wi-Fi, and will carriers connect? So again, coming at it from the enterprise perspective, this whole question in the higher ed market is, whose responsibility is it to make wireless work across the campus? And as Jim pointed out, there's a funding model that makes sense for a stadium or an arena, because at the end of the day, he who writes the check gets to dictate the technology in the system and what have you. And many campuses have experienced a situation where, fine, I get the big venues done, the stadiums, the arenas, there's even a revenue share model that's going back to the university and under that. But I sit there for years with other buildings that have no coverage, maybe it's a little bit of outdoor DAS coverage, but I have other needs and they don't get done. And so there's a question of who owns the responsibility for that. One of the things that we suggest is that in the other vertical markets, the enterprise takes ownership of the airwaves inside the building. And ownership means funding model, so that means funding the DAS, funding the Wi-Fi going in. And if you deem wireless to be critical to the mission, can you think of any other mission-critical infrastructure that the university doesn't have control over? Right? So when it's critical to the mission, you tend to have control over it. So the enterprise model, i.e. when the enterprise, the university is funding, what you get is control. You control then the timing, you control where it goes, you control when it goes in, and now you write in a check for it as well. What the only key requirement there is, if you're going to do that, and we advocate that it's a good thing to do, then it still needs to be built to the requirements that the commercial operators require. Because again, as Jim pointed out, they pay those billions of dollars for those frequency licenses. It is their network. If there's poor quality, they get the black eye that they don't want to have. So the integrator still needs to build that DAS to meet the carrier requirements. But it's a funding model where the enterprise maintains control over timing, location, when it happens. And as long as that DAS is built to the proper specifications, and integrators like us know what those are, and we work directly with the carriers to ensure that it's built to those specifications, then the carriers will in fact come and connect to that system. And that's a model that we look at. So with that, the last question in this section, Mike, is for you. So given that higher ed is using more and more funding models across the campus, and we're talking about dorms and classrooms, do you see these models changing? And could in-building solutions for higher ed be leveraged for multiple uses?
Yeah, so the answer to that, it's kind of a leading question. Yes, we believe that the investment that's made that had traditionally been separated just for DAS can be made in infrastructure that can be used not only for DAS, but for lots of other applications that ride on. Of course, have to invest in infrastructure that has the bandwidth and then the power out to all the different points that you want to be able to access and network for these multiple purposes. But if done properly and wisely, just like in the macro network where Corning is really big in selling fiber to the home, and networks all over the country do multiple things, along with companies like AT&T. There's all kinds of applications that could ride over the same infrastructure built. And to Bill's point, if you own the infrastructure, then you can use this infrastructure for multiple purposes. Now, there have to be dedicated fibers or other media for particular things in some cases. But in a lot of cases, they can be shared for multiple applications that can run. Of course, you got cellular and Wi-Fi that we're talking about now, but also just your Ethernet in general, security cameras, building systems, automation, digital signage, and you can also think about more advanced solutions like location-based services and things like that. And of course, if we have intelligence all the way up to the edge of all, you can put all different kinds of sensors, and you can imagine what different applications might run on people's smart devices in the future. But this network then serves as kind of a linkage back to.
Great. Jim, other comments in this section before we move on?
Well, I mean, actually, when you're looking at the cost of a distributed antenna system, like a third of the cost is actually in rolling the system out and pulling the fiber and the cable. And, you know, and to your point, fiber can handle so much capacity. Why not just pull another strand or two while you're pulling it, right? So, I mean, you know, fiber is less expensive than copper. You don't have to worry about people digging it out and stealing it from you. Because silicon glass can't use it for anything else. And it gives you have then a future-proof solution that you can use for other applications. Because, you know, for instance, from our perspective, you know, we're rolling out LTE, which will support next generation services. The next version supporting LTE Advanced with enough bandwidth, you can actually get a gig download speeds over the commercial airwaves. Well, you really need the ability to have to be able to carry all of that traffic to the remote units as well as to backhaul that traffic. And that's the advantage of fiber optic. That's the advantage of the distributed antenna system. Because largely what you're doing is you're buying a system or installing a system that's largely future-proof. You know, if as new technology comes up, all you need to do is add additional resources at the head end. If you wanted to add public safety, add an additional resource supporting public safety at the head end, making it a lot easier so you could share and utilize that shared wireless infrastructure for a number of services.
Thanks, Jim. So let's move on to the third subject. And this is kind of a little more of a drill down into the stakeholders and the procurement requirements. So the first question is coming my way. Who are the key stakeholders in an in-building wireless solution? Carriers, systems integrators, or the institution? And the answer is yes, all of them. So in this business, there are multiple stakeholders. As we said earlier, certainly the carriers are a stakeholder. It's their network, it's their frequencies, it's their service, it's their business, commercial business operation. The university institution is certainly a stakeholder, but the systems integrator is also a stakeholder in it. And again, as I said earlier, the systems integrator is the one that you have to rely on to do it right, to do wireless right, so that the others will connect, to understand the technology, understand the options as you start to integrate these technologies. You know, we started doing in-building DAS systems 12, 13 years ago. You know, just a bunch of cables and antennas. How hard can it be? It wasn't that hard. It is pretty hard today. You know, things have changed rapidly just in the last few years, and that's why you see the advent of new technology coming from companies like Corning. You see new requirements coming from companies like AT&T. And so it's a very complex deployment process, so there is important stakeholders. But I would suggest that even within the enterprise, within the university, there are multiple stakeholders inside the university that should come to the table. So we're a big believer in having a wireless policy. And so you may have security, facilities, engineering. There are many users of wireless and different types of wireless inside the campus. So and a lot of the conversation tends to be around getting the cell phones to work, which is important. But as Mike pointed out, there are many other wireless services that can also benefit from the deployment of an integrated wireless infrastructure to enhance all services on the campus. For example, we also do a lot of hospitals, a lot of university hospitals. There we didn't get into actual patient care, so wireless being used for patient care, monitoring devices, things along those lines. So there are multiple stakeholders, and our encouragement is to bring those stakeholders to the table to talk about what's going on in the campus, what your plans are, what the goals are, and look at them all as one bucket, if you will, and then figure out the business model behind that to go forward with that. So with that, I'll go to the second question again for you, Jim. With these stakeholders, who is setting the standards for in-building requirement, and are they different for a stadium, an arena, versus a dorm or other building?
Yeah, that's the problem with sharing the mic. You have to be careful who has the mic. So well, let's see. The wireless operator owns the spectrum. If your phone works, the first person you call and complain to is the wireless operator, right? So, and we have a vested interest in ensuring that these systems operate and coexist within our network. So we need to ensure that the system will provide, you know, added capacity and coverage for the venue, but also ensure that it doesn't interfere with the rest of our network. So that's, you know, extremely important. When you're looking at stadiums versus dorm rooms, and we're talking about, you know, one of the advantages of DAS systems, you can kind of shift, you know, the coverage and capacity. But with these DAS systems, you can build systems that are extremely dense. So we, at AT&T Park in San Francisco, they so love their little gizmos and toys over in Silicon Valley. They all, I mean, you go to a conference in Silicon Valley and say, you know, how many people have 4 devices and 5 devices, and somebody in the back row's got 6, right? So, and they're bringing all these things to their ball games. So we actually have antennas every third seat, every third row, in order to provide the capacity for the fans at that venue. Now, when you're looking at dorm rooms, you know, having 2 kids, which I've gone through, and well, one graduated, the other one's still work in progress. But they too spend an inordinate amount of time, you know, using technology and these devices. So we're not deploying them quite as dense as you would in a stadium environment, but in dorm rooms we are. Also, when you're looking at universities, let's not forget the macro. There's a lot to be said for having tower assets pointed on campus and being able to cover the overall area, and then utilize, you know, distributed antennas, small cells, and of course campus Wi-Fi for those areas where you have trouble. So you know that you can't handle, you can't provide enough capacity at a stadium with a macro base station. You just can't do it. So that's where we need the distributed antenna system. If we had the macro using the outside-in approach, we may be able to cover a lot of the buildings and then use outdoor DAS systems or indoor DAS systems or as needed. And that's the advantage of using fiber. You know, frankly, we could install a DAS head end and then fiber out to the various buildings that require the additional services and features of a DAS system and provide those services. So we have a lot of flexibility.
Thanks. Thanks, Jim. So Mike, over to you. So how do these requirements play into purchasing a system, for example, RFP, et cetera? And I think maybe you can expand a little more on what Jim was just talking about. If a DAS is deployed on campus, can the signal sources be used in smaller buildings? Maybe talk a little about the distribution side of that.
Right, so first of all, on the parlaying part, we were just talking about this a little bit earlier with a couple of my colleagues, that it actually parlays very well, especially in what Jim was just saying. If you think about, hey, I want this high-capacity infrastructure that I'm going to own that is used for a lot of different things instead of an individual infrastructure for every single subsystem that is housed on campus. That can, as you can imagine, that can really expand an IT budget in terms of what you can accomplish with that same spend. And so, with a fiber backbone, as Jim was just saying too, that allows a lot of different applications all to be housed on that same infrastructure. Now, with respect to the DAS being used to drive one signal source to drive lots of different things, there are all different kinds of transport systems there. So a couple of things that are important. One is you have to have a DAS that can actually do capacity steering. Okay, so there's lots of DASs that just sit there and somebody has to go in and plug in different cables whenever you want to configure it in different ways. So you got to pick a DAS solution, and a good integrator can help you with that kind of a choice that actually can real-time steer. There are DASs, and we make one of them, of course, that you can set up that will follow, and the signal source can actually move to different locations, can be transported basically to different locations, different times of day, different days of the week, and the like. And so because you do have this virtually unlimited bandwidth pipe going from building to building, you can take an RF source that happens to be in a stadium or in a healthcare facility or in a library, for that matter, and use that to cover multiple buildings that are smaller in nature, but they just need a little bit of capacity. So you just have one big capacity source, maybe a small antenna that doesn't use a whole lot of capacity, and a smaller classroom building that's only used 6 or 8 hours a day, for example. So yeah, it actually works very well in terms of being able to take signal sources, the expensive assets of companies like AT&T that provide the ability to use the spectrum that they're licensed to use, and all users can enjoy the use of those devices in all different places on campus. And one of the other things that Jim also said was covering the outside environment. And so you got the macro environment, and you're going to deploy towers and the like and aim them at the campus. There's going to be shadow points and things on the campus, and that's where things like these same sources can actually be used for indoors, but also to light up different sections of the campus outdoors that might be adjacent to a building. So you may have a quad between dorms or something like that. People are down there on the weekends playing volleyball and moving around. My kids, one's a Chapel Hill, and just graduated from Virginia Tech, so I understand what those campuses look like. So you got lots of people wanting to interact and network and study. We do believe that about 2/3 of the use of devices on campus is for educational purposes, believe it or not, because I think educational purposes a lot of times take maybe more bandwidth and certainly more time in terms of going and getting information that's needed to do the coursework. But yeah, the system can be used, or the infrastructure can be used to look at those outside areas to either with a small cell or an extension outdoor device.
So just to add a little bit on the procurement model, I'll talk about that a little bit. So we see a lot of RFPs, and they all come across my desk. They flow through a number of people in our company, they come across my desk. And the typical RFP that we see from the university says something like this. It says, I'd like an operator to build a DAS on my campus to cover all of the buildings. I don't want to pay anything. I want a third-party funding model to support this, and I want all the buildings done, and I'd like it to be done in 18 months. Has anybody done an RFP like that? Right. Very common, right? And so we look at those RFPs, and we don't respond to them. And sometimes the third-party operators will respond, perhaps the carriers will respond to those. But many of these RFPs that we see have a fundamental lack of understanding of the business model, right? And so the thing that I'll offer in this session is that the fundamental starting point of the business model is that if the university is not going to fund the DAS and is for third-party funding, whether it's directly with the carriers or through a third-party tower company, only the amount of DAS will get built out that AT&T and their counterparts are willing to pay for. And it is their business model that is driving the business model, not yours. Because the third-party operator, and we have done some third-party deployments as well, the third-party operator will only build as much DAS as they can extract monies from AT&T, Verizon, and the other commercial operators. And so the fundamental thinking in the university perhaps needs to change to say, okay, let me identify what can be funded by others based on their commercial business operations, and what needs to be funded by the university, and match that against where you think the need is in the university. And toward that end, one of the suggestions that was made at the DAS Congress last year, is do you have the resources on staff to understand all the subtleties and nuances of all of this? And perhaps you do, perhaps you don't. One of the things that might be a path to go is do an RFP to select a systems integrator, to select an expert in the field that is a neutral party, if you will. Now, we're not neutral. Our job is selling and building and deploying DAS systems, right? There are companies like us that have a lot of expertise that we can lend to you. So you might think about selecting an integrator that can help you with understanding the requirements, what might get funded, what might not get funded, etc. The good news is, Jim and his counterparts, they'll talk to us. They tell us what they're interested in. They know where they want to go. They've got a 2-year, 3-year, 5-year plan for build-outs and what have you. And they're willing to share that information. So perhaps thinking about what's critical and what can get funded before throwing out an RFP might make that RFP process more functional for you and deliver the results we're looking to deliver. So I'll offer that as a comment on the procurement process. With that, I'll move on to the next section, which we call deployment considerations. So, Mike, to you, can you describe the steps in a typical in-building installation, design, installation, commissioning, optimization? We'll spend a few minutes on that.
Sure. So, first of all, it's not, it is complex, but it's very similar to what you would do for a wireless LAN network. Okay? More complicated than that, but it's similar. The difference is primarily that it's licensed spectrum, right? So a carrier has to bring an RF source to be able to use that spectrum in the building. And it's wise to pick a system integrator that's familiar with the business models, how funding does and doesn't work, has worked with carriers and what their design criteria are to make sure that you get sufficient capacity and coverage inside of whatever building or event or part of the campus that you're actually trying to design for. So it's not wise to just kind of go alone and white knuckle it for one of these types of solutions. We at Corning have designed our new platform that is available, the One Wireless platform, specifically for environments like a higher education campus. And it starts with the design. So there's lots of third-party capable software out there that we can employ, or a system integrator, or AT&T, a carrier employs to design what's needed specifically, and it has to be custom designed for the application. What we believe is fiber actually works and conveys the signal over much longer distances without any attenuation or very little attenuation, as opposed to things like coax. And so we believe it's advantage to design with fiber for that particular reason from a design consideration, not just all the RF considerations, but also the infrastructure that's going to carry all those signals from point A to point be. From an installation perspective, our solution is actually plug and play. So everything would arrive on site as needed, and the installation is going to be probably about half as timely. It'll take half as long, roughly, because if you've ever seen a DAS installation, a typical DAS installation takes half-inch coax, which are kind of fairly thick. They look like basically flexible conduit whenever you bend it, and there are a lot of considerations in terms of how tightly you can or can't bend it, and it limits really where you can run the different media to get from the head end out to the different antennas. With a fiber type of solution, it's a lot more flexible. You're dealing sometimes with 200-year-old buildings that didn't have, they weren't made for this big, thick, hard to bend or hard to route conduit to work seamlessly within. And to Jim's point earlier, as the technology advances in some of these buildings, you just want to put it in one time. Because as soon as you go to something like mine, you're going to need multiple coax runs versus a single fiber cable. So that's the reason why we think fiber is an optimal choice for the installation piece. And you have these really dense places like dorm rooms, classrooms, and the like, that maybe older buildings or just weren't built with that kind of technology in mind, maybe when they were built many years ago. From a commissioning perspective, DAS systems can be timely and sometimes difficult to tune and get up and running properly, because with all the different considerations for coverage, there's lots of considerations based on building material, size, shape, all different sorts of things. The macro environment can't be too loud, can't be too soft. There's a lot of tuning that actually has to be done, and a lot of configuration of different connections to make sure that you can connect, you have enough RF source to cover a particular area, for example, and enough power to cover that area from the antenna. Our solution was actually built with that in mind. It actually has a sort of a wizard function, a self-tuning function, it has a listening function. And since you're running technology the whole way to the edge of the network, it can hear the macro environment, and it can hear what it's doing inside the environment. We have these self-tuning features that you can use and continue, and it actually adjusts the gains and other things within the system to optimize that without having to go and tweak a bunch of knobs and switches and the like. So that's the commissioning process. And usually commissioning the DAS is one of the kind of nail-biting events. Sometimes you put everything in, you get a lot of tuning to make sure it actually does exactly what you wanted it to do at the end. And then from an optimization perspective, we talked about this earlier, capacity steering, I believe, is really a key feature, especially on campuses. And the reason is the students and the faculty are the ones using this, this capacity. And if you just have capacity installed in one place for one purpose for one building, and that building is empty during a large portion of the day, but it's really full at other times, then it's just not very effective use of these kind of resources. And so if you build a solution that has that capacity steering function in mind, then when you're at the ball game, great, you have what you need, but on the other 6 days of the week and 400 or 40 other weekends when you're not actually there, you can actually use that base station and capacity for other things, like the dorm rooms or the classrooms or the lighting. You can imagine is that kind of what's happening in the macro environment. There's a lot of steering going on. That's what kind of what you probably heard the term C-RAN. People are talking about how they steer the capacity around during the workday. People aren't home and working. Same thing happens on a campus, in a campus environment. When people are sleeping and working in the dorm room, they need the capacity there. But then when they're out doing things, like in the class, hopefully, and doing other things on the campus, you won't be able to steer that capacity around, at least optimally. And so that's something to consider from an optimization perspective. Basically, we took a lot of inputs. We worked for about 3 or 4 years to develop a solution that we believe is really fit for this environment, and that's what kind of we're introducing you to what we think our Corning One Miles platform could do in a place like higher education.
Something I kind of wanted to hop in, as we're talking about the system design, for all the university campuses that I've attended, they're beautiful buildings. I mean, many are 100-year-old structures. And one of the benefits of these in-building wireless systems is you can stealth the antennas fairly easily. The in-building district antenna systems operate at low power, so the antenna's relatively small. I mean, I was looking around the room to see if I could find one, they're virtually indistinguishable, say that 4 times, from a smoke alarm. And if you don't like it, we could mount it above the ceiling tile if you really just don't even want to see the thing. For several of our other installations, we've become really creative at installing them behind signs. I already mentioned about installing them underneath seats. When you're driving around town, I used to live in Colorado, and I-25 is the main interstate between Denver and Colorado Springs. When you're driving from Denver to Colorado Springs and you look to your right about Castle Rock, which is about midway, the tallest evergreen is of course not an evergreen, it's a cell tower. So there's all kinds of ways that we can propagate and get RF within a facility. You've got church steeples, light poles behind signs, behind or above ceilings, and all that goes into the system design. But the reason for pointing that out is because when you're looking at this large undertaking of deploying the system, you don't want to say, geez, this building was built in the 1800s. And I just don't want to destroy the aesthetics. Or I will not allow you to destroy the aesthetics, period, right? So, but with that in mind, this technology does give you the flexibility of being able to deploy a system to provide a service to your students, faculty, and staff without impairing the aesthetics of your campus.
So the last question is my way, and that is, what is the role of systems integrator, and what are the key certifications and other criteria in selecting a qualified systems integrator, and what is the impact on the enterprise's IT staff? So we're going to talk a little about this earlier. One of the things that I'll say about the role of systems integrator, and by the way, whether it's a third-party funded model or a carrier-funded model, us integrators are the ones doing the work. We're either doing it for AT&T or we're doing it for a tower company. So the integrator is always a part of the play here. And one of the things that's changed a lot in the last few years is the requirements to be a systems integrator are much more stringent today. The bar has been raised. AT&T has certainly raised the bar, and on terms of certifications and training. So you've got to know the technology. You heard Mike talk about all the new technology that Corning has. So your engineers, RF engineers, project managers need to be trained and certified in the products. If I go back 7, 8 years ago, nobody ever asked for a certification. I had installers and RF engineers doing all kinds of work. The qualifications were rarely ever even asked about. Today, it's very, very important that an integrator really understand the technology, number one, the technology they're deploying. They really understand the tools, and as Mike or Jim mentioned the tools. Those tools that are used to do DAS design are very expensive. They're very expensive software licenses with very expensive maintenance. That company in Canada is doing really well with what they're doing. And so it's an investment in the training of people in tools and technology to be an integrator in this space. Now, at the same time, we're seeing a whole bunch of more folks enter this space. And they're coming at it saying it's a $15 billion industry. It's just a bunch of cables and antennas. How hard can it be? I can do this. Right? And what we're finding is that that's not the case. And really, credit AT&T. AT&T of all the carriers is really leading the charge in raising the bar in terms of the technology that goes in. We talk about the advanced 4G technologies being deployed, what have you, which drives to the technology gets deployed, but also to the qualifications of the folks actually doing the work, to the point where we now have to provide those certifications that this person is on site on this day with this level of training, this level of certification. So the investment on the part of the integrator is very, very important. So as you are looking at potentially working with integrators, that's a good 2 or 3 pages of questions and answers in your RFP about who you're dealing with, what those certifications are, what investment is that integrator making into this space. And we think that's very, very important. Again, we've been doing it for a long time. Our company, Black Box, is investing in our wireless solutions practice to go build these networks and build the way they need to be. Complexity has just gone through the roof in the last 5 years. Really driven by all the 4G technology, and I'm sure maybe in some of the other sessions you see the famous chart, right, that goes from now out to 2016, 2018 of the growth, and it's all about data, it's all about video, and it's all going across these networks, right? And so that growth in just the packets is tremendous. That changes the game for everybody in the game, certainly for us as an integrator as well. So I think those issues are very, very important to be looked at today, and they were perhaps less important a few years back. So we're very strong now. The final question, Jim, we'll let you close it out, and just one piece, and that is, what is carrier coordination, and how do you go about that? And we'll turn it into Q&A from there.
Well, carrier coordination, I mean, we need to ensure that we know what devices are installed utilizing our spectrum, and regardless of the business model, whether it's the venue or university-owned, third-party neutral host-owned, or carrier-owned, we need to know it's operating in our spectrum, and so therefore there is a process, and the process of coordinating with the carriers is usually done by the owner of the system, so that the third-party integrator would take, the third-party neutral host would take responsibility for that. They may turn that over to the integrator, but if you decide to deploy your own system, you've taken ownership and responsibility for integrating and interfacing with the wireless operators. And the problem with that, the wireless operator can sit back and go, well, I want to look at your design, and I need to ensure that this system will not only impair our network, but will perform as expected. And we may sit back and go, well, we don't want to join the system unless you make a few changes or tweaks to the system, because at the end of the day, if it doesn't work, who are they going to call? They're going to be calling us, not anybody else, right? And to the point about the tremendous growth in mobile data traffic, since January of 2007, we have seen a 50,000% growth in mobile data traffic. So when you graph a 50,000% growth, I wish my 401k has performed as well. We'd all have this via teleconference, I'd be in Bali with scuba gear on, right? So, wish we all had that problem, right? But it's why we're deploying so much infrastructure within these venues. It's why we're deploying with advanced systems to ensure that the people who are installing it are trained. Paul Devlin, who's in charge of our construction and engineering group, shared with us pictures of kind of like a before and after. They had equipment stacked on top of cardboard boxes, and cables kind of strewn all over the place, and of course the after, everything's in racks and labeled, and the cables just right. So, because when you look at these investments, they're long-term investments, and because they are expensive, they are long-term investments, and with the data system, largely, once it's built, you could add additional technology and services at the head end without having to disrupt the wired infrastructure that's built throughout the campus.
So are there any questions from the audience? We're glad to answer. Yes, sir.
Do you recommend RFI as the initial procurement process instead of going to RFP?
What was the person recommending?
RFI.
RFI. I'll take that one and then I'll pass on the points. Yeah, I do. I think the RFI process is an excellent way to find out who you want to play with, right? Who's out there and what their qualifications are, and maybe a short list of folks that understand the various business models and what have you. So I think, a two-step process, if you will, is a good thing to do. One thing that, as an integrator, we have limited resources, and we look at a lot of RFPs, and when an RFP is sort of kind of all over the map, and we look at it and we say, there's no deal to be done here, then we don't want to invest the resource to go do it. We all have limited resources. So the RFI process is a good way to get an information exchange going back and forth. So I'm very strongly in favor of that. Anyone else want to comment? Next question. Don't be bashful, we will make one up and call it.
questions there. Good.
Right, that's right. Yes, sir.
So probably kind of a simple question, but I think another section from the last year about that, one of the questions I think was showing about kind of the infrastructure, all the services that had set up, stadiums, and we were looking at, 20 racks full of gear, cables running up and down, everything. It's massive, really, and we were asking about how much space we need to have to store all that kind of infrastructure, like just gas. What if you just comment on that, what kind of hardware do we have to be able to support power pressures and stuff around the back end, alternatives and stuff like that. Curious.
Okay, so the question is really goes to if you're deploying gas on a campus, how much space, power, racks, and things along those lines. I'll answer the first part of that. A stadium and arena is very different than other buildings. Right? So when we do, call it traditional buildings, non-stadium arenas, we're taking relatively small amounts of space. The actual signal source equipment from the carriers is much more compact now than it used to be, and so on. The actual head-end equipment is rack mountable, it's very compact. The remote units in the IDFs are very small, some can be hung on the wall, some hung on a rack and such. A lot of flexibility in how you do that. When you get into the stadiums and arenas, now you're starting to talk about a lot of equipment. The actual DAS equipment isn't the bulk of the equipment. It's actually, most of that's the signal source equipment because of that extreme amount of capacity that has to be driven in there, in that space. The good news, though, to the point that Mike made earlier, is that if you're doing a arena or a stadium and then other parts of the campus, that becomes your carrier hotel. So you gobble up the space that you need there, but then you take virtually no space or very little space in other parts of the campus as you're distributing across that fiber. So you can start to get some trade-off there as well.
Well, I have a few things to say. When the lights went out at the Super Bowl game 2 years ago, I'm happy to report our distributed antenna system did not go down. We had a dedicated utility feed from the utility company. We had a dedicated battery backup system. We also had a diesel generator. And our technicians, because it's, of course, Super Bowl is such a high-profile event, right? We had technicians on site who, well, they didn't have to, but they powered up a diesel generator just in case, because nobody knew what that was going on. But at least if something did go wrong, we wanted to make sure the gas system remained in operation. So in addition to all the things that we're talking about that take up space, we have to worry about things like power backup. Also, like Hurricane Katrina, that the lesson learned there, these large public venues aren't there just to support the events for the public venue. And oftentimes, in the event of a disaster, those events are then recommissioned, if you will, and then used for housing, if you will. The actual size, it's really hard to answer the question, how much room do you need? Because it's based on, how much capacity is required. And then each operator, we'll look at it and go, oh my God, we've got this 50,000% growth. We try to design and plan systems around a 3-year. That is, we don't want to mess with it for 3 years. Sometimes we're successful, sometimes we're not. But we're trying to get ahead of that curve, right? That's our curve. And then you have the other wireless carriers, and they're looking at their customer base, market potential, and the like. Now, the advantage that universities have over, say, other venues is you're dealing with a population that everyone has a cell phone. They're all using traffic. And the wireless operator wants to keep those customers as they become adults. But as I transgress, if you have any new buildings that are about to be constructed, let's think about wireless when you're building the construction. When like I said, the most expensive, but one of the costs, the high costs of deploying DAS was actually pulling the fiber. So when you're building a building, allow for fiber conduits between floors, between buildings. The head end where all this equipment needs to be stored will obviously have to have power. But it also has to be air conditioned because all this equipment unfortunately does use up and consume and generate a lot of heat. The IDF clauses where the remote units are typically installed, they have 2 force peak power. So there's a lot of things, and that's really where the integrators come into play and say, hey, look, before you start laying the foundation, let's take into account wireless, because when you look at wireless, it's almost like the 4th utility, right? So people nowadays expect it, and unfortunately, when there's an emergency on campus, you need it. So we need to kind of take it into account when you're actually building these buildings as well.
I've talked a little bit more about space, I think a little bit more specifically. In fact, I talked about this one platform a little bit earlier. We designed it intentionally with space in mind. In fact, at the head end, our head end takes half the space of any competitive solution out there right now. When you get to the closet, if you do an integrated infrastructure, you can take a 40U rack space in an IDF and take it down to 1 or 2U. Okay, that's the magnitude of the change that you see when you integrate these different platforms. Because frankly, a lot of these closets are full of Cat 5 and 6 cables. And the other reality that hasn't been talked about is historically, DAS solutions only live for 3 or 4 years. There's the newest wireless technology that comes out, and people either rip and replace all the infrastructure, or they'll overbuild on top of that, and you end up with clogging and clogging and clogging. And the point we like to make is if you do an all-optical infrastructure, just like that can live for the life of the building. You don't replace the plumbing in your building every 3 or 4 years. We don't think you should be replacing the networks in the physical infrastructure, the physical layer of the infrastructure in your buildings every 3 or 4 years. So I would suggest that you can have a lot less space, a lot less heat generation, because we have, in the IDF specifically, most DAS solutions use a lot of power and generate a lot of heat even in the closets, and our solution generates virtually very little, almost no heat in the closet, at least as a power supply, that's it. So if space is a consideration, then, I mean, all vendors I'm sure are trying to get better, but our solution is significantly less space, more local space efficient.
Thanks, Mike. We have time for maybe one more question, and we'll just make a couple of closing comments and move on. Any other questions? Do you have any last comments?
Good.
Mike? We thank you.